Welcome everybody to the Low Histamine Diet webinar. And tonight we have Leanne Reeves, who's a very specialist gastroenterology and allergy dietitian who has done an immense amount of research with her colleague on the histamine diet, looking at all the references and all the information, because there is so much conflicting information out there. Leanne, welcome.
Hi, Marianne. Thanks for having me.
That's absolute pleasure. Leanne, can you tell us the name of the other dietitian who's been very heavily involved with getting together all the information on the low histamine diet?
Yeah, there's two actually,
Okay,
Deborah Howland and Aisling Phelan. Yeah, and
brilliant.
we've been working closely together for actually about the last year, working through all the papers to look at the figures and update our BDA diet sheet.
That's fantastic. And how many papers do you reckon you've looked at? I mean, it must be hundreds, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I don't know, a lot. There's a big pile on my desk.
Yeah. And so your reason for doing that is really trying to get down to the nitty-gritty of what foods people should avoid and what foods are safe for people to have. Is that the idea
Yeah,
behind this?
yes, absolutely. I mean, we've had a diet sheet that we've been using, that I updated about 5 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago. And of course, there's new data coming out all the time. What I wanted to do was make sure that we went back through as many papers as we could find to get, to put together as an accurate list as we could do, really, because there's so many lists around and they all say different things. Yeah, you want to be able to give your patients the most accurate information. So
Yeah, it's brilliant. And
yeah.
I do see a lot of patients who are on the histamine diet who are pulling stuff off the internet, which is incredibly restrictive and, putting them at risk of malnutrition, basically, taking out lots of fruit and vegetables and all sorts of things. So it will be really interesting to see today and go through what you've discovered, what you found, and what the most up-to-date information is on the low histamine diet. So let's just start with, what is histamine?
Okay, well, histamine is a diamine. It's a natural chemical that's made by the body. Actually, we need it. It has lots of different functions around the body, which include, as you've got listed, it stimulates stomach acid secretion, smooth muscle contraction, dilates or widens blood vessels. So, for example, if that happens in the skin, then you'll get flushing. Which is one of the many symptoms that people experience. It also acts as a neurotransmitter, so that's a chemical messenger that helps the nerves to communicate with each other. It's also involved in the sleep-wake cycle, and then most of us will be familiar with it in relation to the immune system, where in an allergic reaction, for example. So if you're somebody that gets hay fever, let's say, and you get itching, sneezing, runny eyes, swelling of your eyes, maybe redness, maybe rashes to certain pollens, for example, that's because histamine has been released and that's contributing to all of these symptoms. And then you'll take an antihistamine to block the effect of the histamine, and then that helps to control the symptoms. So it is something that's needed in the body in some respects. Obviously, you don't really want too much of it to cause those allergic symptoms, but it's also something that we ingest in our diet, in foods and drinks.
So I think you've already hit on one of the issues with this diet, is that, and we'll go into this in more detail later, is that it's involved in immune system reactions like allergic reactions. But what we're talking about today is different to that. It's about histamine intolerance. So we'll go into that in more detail in a minute. But I gather there are other amines as well as histamine. Is that correct?
Yes, there are, and the structure, the classification varies according to the structure, but the others that we're perhaps interested in terms of the diet include tyramine, putrescine, and cadaverine, and they can be present in varying amounts in foods and drinks as well as histamine.
Okay. So we talk a lot about, or we hear a lot of people talking about diamine oxidase, DAO,
Mm.
as a supplement that people take if they've got histamine sensitivity. So what is DAO?
Yeah, well, diamine oxidase is an enzyme that's found produced on the lining of the gut. So it's the key one that's relevant for what we're talking about with breaking down the histamine that we ingest in our diet, because it's in the gut, and if it breaks down what we ingest, then the levels won't rise and then we don't get the symptoms. But some people don't seem to produce enough of it, or there might be other reasons why the enzyme's not effective, that the levels do increase. And then there's also this other enzyme, the histamine N-methyltransferase, or HNMT, which breaks down the histamine within the cells. So probably less relevant to what we ingest in foods, but will break down histamine from other sources
Okay,
within the
so
body.
what we're looking at is this enzyme that if it's not working or we haven't got enough of it, that you're going to get histamine building up because there's nothing to break it down efficiently.
Yeah,
And it's that build-up of the histamine that causes the symptoms. Is that correct?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So take us through histamine and how it might build up. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so if we're ingesting histamine in the diet, which it can include alcoholic drinks, as you've got there, or it might be produced by certain microbes in the gut, we've got that increase in histamine, and then possibly this impaired function of the diamine oxidase for whatever reason, which I'll go through in a moment, and then that will then lead to less of the diamine oxidase being able to break down the histamine, and then you get the symptoms. So there's a number of reasons why the diamine oxidase might not work, or there might not be enough of it. So certain medications, for example, can block the function of it. So common ones that a lot of people may take could be non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like aspirin, and some types of antidepressants. But of course, you shouldn't stop taking medication without speaking to your doctor first. Alcohol actually doesn't directly affect the diamine oxidase, but it does block the alcohol dehydrogenase, which is another enzyme slightly further along the pathway of breaking down the histamine. So it still can have an impact. And then our genetics, some of us might actually just be predisposed to not produce enough of the diamine oxidase. And unfortunately, that's not something we can do anything about. There are things called cofactors, certain vitamins and also copper. So vitamins B6 and C and copper that we get in our diet are needed for the diamine oxidase to function correctly. And then there might be another reason, might be that there's been damage to the lining of the gut through diseases. So, for example, celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease, or it might be through an infection, or it might be because somebody's been on chemotherapy. All of those things could contribute to damaging the lining of the gut, and therefore reduce the function of the enzyme that's found there. And then lastly, we've got competition from these other amines that we just mentioned. The putrescine and cadaverine, for example, are also broken down by the diamine oxidase. And if they get there first, if there's more of those in the food along with the histamine, then they'll also take up some of that enzyme, and then there's less of it to break down the histamine.
Okay, that's really interesting. So with the DAO, we're really looking, it could be impaired function, so it's not functioning. You've got adequate amounts, but it's just not working well,
Mm.
or you're actually not producing enough of it in the first place. And all these aspects like medications, alcohol, genetics, etc., can all affect that. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
And I always think a useful way to look at cofactors is if you have a train trying to leave Paddington Station, you've got the carriage, but the vitamins and minerals are like the wheels of the train. So that train is not going to get out of the station without its wheels. So
Yeah.
those
Mhm.
cofactors, they're like the wheels of the train, aren't they? So, you may have the DAO, but it's not going to work properly. The whole pathway is not going to work properly unless you've got those cofactors. Would that be a good
Yeah,
description?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Histamine, it affects so many parts of the body. Take us through that. I mean, you've got the respiratory system, the nervous system. The
Yeah, it can. I mean, for some people, it might literally only be gut symptoms and they don't get any other symptoms. For others, it might be more respiratory. But for some, it's a bit of everything. And until they understand the link and understand that histamine can affect all these different areas of the body, it is hard to see a link or to understand, what's going on. So, I mean, the respiratory system, so if we go through them, runny nose, sneezing, itchy or blocked nose, shortness of breath, all of those might happen in, if you've got hay fever, for example. So we know, there are the receptors that the histamine attaches to, and they cause the symptoms. And there are different receptors around in different areas of the body. So you get these varying symptoms. I mean, we both see a lot of people with irritable bowel syndrome and bloating, wind, diarrhea, constipation. All of those are really common symptoms, aren't they, for IBS?
Yeah.
And some people, I find actually that the key is that they're not tolerating the high histamine foods very well. So by reducing them, they find their symptoms improve there. The main part of this diagnosis diagram came from the paper that I've referenced at the bottom there. I added a few other symptoms like the urinary system, because I've seen a few people who have had a diagnosis of interstitial cystitis or painful bladder, and they'd already found a dietary link. And then when you look at the foods that are often implicated in that specifically, you realize, oh, they're pretty much all on the high histamine list. And again, it's linked to the probably having more mast cells in the bladder, I think. The nervous systems, or headaches and migraines, quite common symptoms. That said, not everybody with migraine will have a problem with food, but those who do see a dietary link, often it's the either high histamine or high tyramine foods that are causing the symptoms. Feeling the fatigue, I think, is a really common symptom for a lot of people, and not being able to sleep, which obviously then going to lead to fatigue. But that's, having experienced that myself for a long time, it's a horrible thing to put up with and to manage. And if you've got lots of histamine circulating, that can have an impact on your ability to sleep. Heart pounding, heart palpitations, those are other symptoms that that people often report, or it might be a drop in blood pressure. And then hormones, so maybe symptoms with the hormones changing, but also without realizing it until perhaps they're a lot older, as you know, will say, oh, I've always had really heavy painful periods. There seems to be a link with that. And then the skin symptoms, we've got feeling itchy, or the hot flushes, rashes. So lots and lots of different symptoms essentially. Yeah.
And you won't necessarily, as you said at the beginning, you're not necessarily going to have all of these symptoms,
No, no.
but it's just to highlight that a high histamine circulating could cause any of these symptoms.
Could
I
cause
mean,
any of them.
yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of these symptoms could be caused by a million other things as well, but
absolutely. Yeah,
with high
yeah,
histamine, they can cause these symptoms.
yeah.
So, what about things like stress? Because people often talk about stress being a major contributor towards histamine sensitivity or intolerance.
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider stress. Actually, there is evidence that stress may cause the mast cells that hold on to the histamine to release histamine, so that might contribute to more histamine circulating around the body. But a lot of us experience a lot of stressful situations, a lot of chronic stress. And that stress response has become a norm, really, which means that you're shallow breathing, you're using the wrong muscles to breathe, you're not inflating the lungs fully, and therefore you're also breathing too quickly. And that can then perpetuate the stress response. So it's sort of a vicious cycle. But there are lots of symptoms that actually can result from that over breathing, as it's called, like heart palpitations, pins and needles, feeling permanently exhausted, muscle aches and pains, bloating, feeling lightheaded, headaches. All of these symptoms that might be associated with histamine intolerance are actually a result of the stress response, and not necessarily what you've just eaten.
It's almost like you've got 2 different conditions and you're mistaking the stress response for a histamine intolerance.
And it's very
Mm.
easy to just look at what you've just eaten and think, oh, it must be that. I'm going to have to take that out of my diet as well. Rather than thinking, okay, right, well, I've had a really stressful day today. I probably haven't been breathing properly. I haven't taken any time to wind down. So maybe I need to, address that rather than restrict my diet even further.
A lot of my patients will say it's really strange because sometimes I can tolerate this high histamine food, and other times I can't. And could that be partly to do with the stress they're under at the time? So if they're very
Yeah,
stressed at that time, they then suddenly can't tolerate that food. Whereas when they're less stressed, at other times they're on holiday, more relaxed, suddenly they find they can eat a more varied diet with some of the high histamine foods without any problem.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really common scenario actually, and that's something I try and
Yeah.
remember to ask is that how are you when you're on holiday?
Mm.
Do you feel any better? Can you tolerate more foods? And often people will say yes, they can. So yeah, that's a really good indicator. It's something that's worth thinking about.
So, what would you suggest people look at if they are feeling stressed and they don't feel that diet is relevant?
Take steps to calm that stress response. So that might include hypnotherapy or taking time to exercise, mindfulness, meditation, all those sorts of things, really. I think a key factor that we're starting to learn more about now is how stress can affect the balance of the gut microbes, and that we now know has an impact on our overall health, not just our gut health, but lots of different aspects, lots of different conditions, and also our mood. And there's also now some papers that show how what they call a dysbiotic gut, so a less than ideal balance of gut microbes, can also be linked to histamine intolerance because they're producing histamine themselves. So that also adds to that overall load of histamine.
So I think you've made it really clear that stress can have a direct effect on the gut bacteria, and that in turn can affect your vulnerability to developing histamine intolerance. But what about the people who have no stress in their lives or no particular stress in their lives? How much can their gut bacteria cause a rise in histamine?
Gut microbiome as a whole, some of them have the ability to produce the enzyme, that histidine decarboxylase enzyme that converts histidine into histamine. So thereby it can increase the level of histamine in the gut. And there are a couple of studies. I mean, these are, they're usually, there's still small numbers they've looked at, but there was one from 2018 that looked at a group of people with histamine intolerance, and they found that the people with a histamine intolerance had a different balance of gut bacteria to the controls. And they certainly had lower levels of the bifidobacteria, which the bacteria that help to keep the lining of the gut healthy, whereas the healthy controls actually had a lot more of those. So they suggested that there is this dysbiosis, this imbalance of bacteria and a poor intestinal barrier. So the lining of the gut isn't as healthy as it could be, essentially, in the people with histamine intolerance.
I'm really interested in the fact that you talk about the lining of the gut not being as good as it could be in patients with histamine intolerance. Is this the same thing that we hear people refer to as leaky gut syndrome?
Yes, it's a more permeable gut that instead of just letting nutrients through as it should, it also allows larger molecules or microbes through that can then cause health problems.
And that healthy gut wall is going to really rely on the quality of the microbes in your gut. And the microbes, in turn, really rely on the quality of diet you give them, the vitamins, the minerals, the fibers, all the bits that come with your food will help to build that healthy gut, which is why we're really keen that people don't use strict elimination diets for extended periods of time. And in fact, that they only use elimination diets such as the low histamine diet if they really feel it's necessary. So we've looked at how stress can affect the risks of you developing histamine intolerance and how the bacteria can play a role in this condition. Another area I want to look at now, an area of increasing focus, is our hormones, particularly obviously in women, and how that may affect your risk of developing histamine intolerance. Leanne, what happens to the hormones and their effects on histamine levels during pregnancy?
Well, pregnant women often report that their tolerance has improved, and that's because the levels of diamine oxidase are higher as the placenta produces it. So, in fact, levels can be up to 500 times the level before pregnancy.
So they often feel that their histamine intolerance has actually got better during their pregnancy.
Yeah, it can do.
What about the menopause? A lot of women talk about wanting to use the low histamine diet during this period of their life. Is there evidence to support the use of the low histamine diet during the menopause? And is there evidence that it makes the menopause symptoms better?
No, I think we need a lot more research, so in terms of evidence, I'm not aware that we've had any studies. We know that histamine is produced by mast cells and other cells in the uterus and the ovaries, and hormones can trigger those mast cells to release histamine, and histamine also stimulates the production of one of the estrogen hormones. And there's also the diamine oxidase that we've just been talking about. The levels vary through the menstrual cycle. There certainly is a link, but we do need more studies, and we do need to be really careful about over restricting the diet, particularly at a time when the body really needs good nutrition and a varied healthy diet to help the
Mm,
the
mm,
gut microbiome. And I think that's my concern, is that the diet ends up becoming
mm,
way
mm.
too restricted, really. There does seem to be a link, and we just need to learn a little bit more about it. Yeah.
So, okay, so that's really
Mm,
interesting. I want to just touch on long COVID because actually,
mhm,
I don't know what you feel, but my feeling in my clinic is that one of the reasons there's been more research on histamine recently is that a lot of people with long COVID in the last couple of years, it's been suggested that they do a low histamine diet. So,
mm.
could you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I certainly was seeing people like, well, through COVID, or just following the lockdowns that were coming into the allergy clinic, for example, with reactions to things that they'd never had reactions to before, having had COVID, and we did start to see a link for some people with the higher histamine foods, having ruled out allergy essentially. So for some people, there does seem to be a link, and it has been helpful for some to help manage their symptoms. I don't know enough. I haven't studied the effects of COVID specifically. But again, like you were just saying, it's a balancing act, isn't it? Of yes, okay, of avoiding the things that are triggering symptoms, but not over restricting, because particularly, if you've been unwell for another reason, like having COVID, you need a well-balanced, nutritious diet to help you recover. So essentially, what we have to say is just, yes, okay, we can experiment with the diet. It's not going to it doesn't help everybody. I've definitely seen some people with long COVID who haven't responded to a low histamine diet at all. But for those who have found a link, then the important thing is to get as much support as they can to ensure that their diet does provide all the nutrition that they need.
Yeah, and I think we'll go into this in more detail in a minute, but the other thing is
Mhm.
the low histamine diet. I see a lot of patients who come to me on a low histamine diet, which they've been following for, 2 years, for instance, or even longer.
Mm.
And actually, the histamine diet, low histamine diet is for 2 to 4 weeks, not any longer than that. And then you reintroduce to a level of tolerance the foods so you can find out what you tolerate. So getting that support and guidance from a specialist dietitian is really important to help you with that if you're going to do it for long COVID, and to make sure that what you're cooking is practical when you're exhausted. You
Yeah.
still got to shop and cook and you haven't got much energy anyway. So, and as you said, you need to be as well nourished as possible during this time to really give yourself the best chance of getting better. So actually being on a
Mm.
very restricted diet without any help is, perhaps detrimental. But as you say, some people have seen a huge benefit and others have seen no benefit. But I think it's important that we touched on it.
Yeah.
So let's say you pretty much think, okay, I think I may have a histamine problem. How do you know if it's a histamine problem or something else? Because a lot of the symptoms we've already said look really similar to allergy symptoms.
Looking
Mm.
at that diagram, with all the symptoms, somebody with an allergy could have any of those symptoms. So it can be helpful to rule it out.
So I just want to
Yeah.
make the differentiation between allergy and histamine intolerance. So what we're saying really here is histamine intolerance is not the same as food allergy. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So although histamine is involved in both, the reason why the levels have increased is different. So in allergy, the immune system is involved basically. So you're having an immune mediated reaction, either IgE or non-IgE mediated reactions. So that's really the key thing, is that allergy involves the immune system, and intolerance doesn't.
Okay, so histamine tolerance is about a buildup of something that shouldn't be there in such high quantities. It's nothing to do with
Yeah.
the immune system.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really useful. And so therefore, are we safe in saying that allergy testing would be no use for histamine intolerance?
Yes, unfortunately, it would make life so much easier if we did have some good tests to help us diagnose it. But really, if we do any testing, we're ruling out allergy.
I had a patient this week who had a massive reaction to salmon. And we were talking about this thing called scombroid poisoning, also known as histamine intoxication. And that
Mm.
comes from poorly stored oily fish, those things like mackerel, sardines, tuna. Would that happen in salmon as well? Because it's an oily fish? Could it happen
Yes,
in salmon?
yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, any
Absolutely.
oily fish, yeah,
So
yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong. This is where the fish is starting to degrade because it's not been stored well.
Mm,
And as the flesh of the fish degrades, the histamine level goes up significantly in that fish. So when people eat it, they're getting a massive dose of histamine in the food they're eating. And it ends up giving them symptoms very similar to an allergic reaction. So they assume
mm.
that they're allergic to the fish when actually it was just a massive intake of histamine. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, the levels can be really high, over 500 milligrams per kilogram, which is a
Mm.
high load. So they'll basically, that would make anybody ill, whether they've got enough diamine oxidase enzyme or not.
Okay.
If the levels are high enough, anyone's going to be ill with it.
It's
And I
nothing
think
to do with histamine intolerance. It's nothing to do with that. It's a complete
no,
separate thing.
absolutely. No, it's
Yeah.
just because there's been so much in there. I think some cheeses have also been implicated in this. So it's not just fish. And one of the papers I found said that up to 40% of foodborne outbreaks of food poisoning in Europe and the US were due to histamine intoxication. So it's quite a high number.
That's
It is. Yeah.
that makes it
Yeah.
quite a major issue.
Yeah. So it's
And
not as
and
rare
will
as
be,
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
not as rare, and will be confusing people because they'll assume, because the symptoms are very similar to an allergy or allergic reaction, a lot of people are gonna go around thinking, "Right, well, I'm obviously allergic to that
The
cheese or
fish, yes,
that
yes.
fish."
So I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I've seen a lot of people actually
Mm,
over the years that have assumed that that's the
mm,
case.
mm,
And
mm.
also, just when you're talking about the storage, the reason why the oily fish tends to be a bit worse than white fish is because the oily fish has more of the histidine, so the precursor, and then that then will easily get converted to histamine. I mean, white fish potentially, can still have high levels of histamine if it's not stored correctly or handled correctly. And you can get different levels in the same fish as well. So if a group of people are eating a meal that's all from the same fish, you could get some people that are unwell having had a bit that's got the high levels in, and somebody else who isn't. So
Okay,
that's
that's
something I learned
interesting. Yeah.
recently reading the papers. Yeah, I hadn't realized that.
So that you could have a massive salmon that you're all sharing
Mm,
and some people react and some people don't. Now, the
mm,
white fish, so you're saying if
mm.
it degrades, it'll get histamine, but the quantity of histamine is probably not as large as it is in the oily fish. So it's the
Yeah.
oily fish that tend to cause the histamine intoxication or scromboid poisoning. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. So
Okay.
yeah, so the whitefish tend
Okay.
to start with lower levels and quite often don't tend to
Okay.
go quite so high as the oily fish.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So basically, what I want to point out here is that this scromboid poisoning or histamine intoxication is not an allergic reaction. It's
Yeah.
instead due to the very high levels of histamine in the food. Histamine is also released during an allergic reaction. Therefore, the symptoms can look very similar to allergy, but this is not allergy.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. The blood testing we've got for histamine, is it reliable or unreliable?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a test that can help to diagnose it yet. There are tests around, not on the NHS, but there are private tests around that will measure the diamine oxidase blood level. And certainly, as yet, we still can't say for sure that the level in the blood accurately reflects the level in the gut, in the intestines. So that's important to start with. If you're measuring something, you want to know that it's a reliable marker for what you're testing for, right? One paper also suggested that you'd need several tests over several days to get an idea, and that one single test at a random time of the day is also not going to be particularly helpful. But then there are several papers that were published in the last year that really showed that they couldn't show that the diamine oxidase reflected the level of tolerance to the high histamine foods, essentially. So
I think that's a really important bit. So
yeah,
it didn't really matter what your levels were in the blood. It really wasn't helpful for diagnosing
no.
whether you were going to get histamine intolerance.
Yeah, in fact, one
Correct.
of those papers that was they were looking at over 1,000 subjects, and only 56% of them without the histamine intolerance had a normal diamine oxidase.
So people who had no problems with histamine or histamine intolerance
Yeah,
had odd levels as well, and yet they had no problems with
and then they
histamine.
had
Correct?
yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so we just
Yeah.
can't use it as a
Mm,
reliable marker at the
at the
moment. Yeah,
moment. Okay.
yeah.
What about the diamine oxidase supplements?
Yeah, this is interesting. There are quite a few brands available on the market now. A lot of them are made from pork kidney, and there are some made from beans and pulses. Legumes is the word I'm trying to think of. What we still need is a decent number of people with a histamine intolerance compared to people who don't have one, taking the enzyme supplement and comparing the effect. I did find another more recent paper just from last year that compared the effect in a simulated study, not in actually in people, where they compared how the diamine oxidase that came from pea sprouts versus from pork kidney versus an actual supplement. And they found that the one that came from the pea sprout had the greatest ability to break down the histamine than the other two.
The jury is still out, is what we're
I
saying.
think so, but having said that,
Mm.
can't see that it's going to do any harm. So
Okay,
I do quite often actually, mention them to people and leave it up to them to decide whether they want to experiment, because it's a cost. They're not cheap. Certainly if you were going to be taking it on a daily basis. What a lot of my patients tend to do is, if they think that it's helpful, if they've sort of try it and they think, yeah, I think it probably does help a little bit, then they keep it to take when they're eating away from home and they've got a bit less control over their diet,
good
because they can
idea.
control their histamine intake when they're at home.
And they feel that they can then eat more freely and socialize more easily. Because I mean, that is
Yeah,
the trouble with these diets, is that it's all very well, but it can be terribly socially isolating. You
yeah,
can't suddenly go and eat a meal with mates and go around somebody's house for dinner. So
no,
I
that's right.
guess the appeal of these is that, if they do help a patient support eating a normal diet when they're out, then that's got to be a good thing. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I don't think there's any harm in trying it. And to say, certainly there are studies that seem to show that it is effective. So, but as I say, they don't all agree yet. So we need some more.
Okay. You're basically saying give it a go if you can afford it and you feel it helps, that's great. It doesn't seem to do any harm. Only stick to the manufacturer's guidelines on how much you take.
Yeah,
Is that right?
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
What's next? So we've sort of gone through the different aspects, but we now need to look and see whether people can actually get a diagnosis. So the only way, because you're saying is there are no blood tests to test for this. The
Mm.
only way to test whether histamine is an issue is to go on a low histamine diet for 2 to 4 weeks. Is that correct?
Yeah. 2 to 4 weeks should be enough to establish whether there's a link. That's really what
Okay.
you're looking for. And then of course, there's a longer process to then go through to work out how much and how often you can tolerate the foods. But yeah,
Okay.
that's really what you have to do.
So, what I want to highlight here, and I think this is the big difference, and we touched on this very early on tonight, is what foods do we definitely know can cause high histamine levels, and what foods is it questionable and you perhaps don't need to eliminate in certain circumstances. So, I want to go through the ones that everybody tends to agree on that do cause a problem, whatever list you're looking at. So, things like pork, cured meat, game, aged beef, oily fish, shellfish, fish that's not freshly, it's not fresh, basically, one that's been allowed to degrade slightly, not been kept adequately, mature cheese, hard and soft goat or sheep cheese, things like sour cream, kefir, yogurt, and buttermilk. Alcohol like wine, beer, cider, and champagne. And then some sauces like the fermented soya sauces, the ketchups, the Worcestershire sauces, and then things like yeast extract as well can be a problem. But this is the bit that there's a lot of questioning over, and where I see, and I'd really value your opinion on this, Leanne, because I see a lot of patients who've pulled low histamine diet information sheets off the internet, and it's taken pretty much all fruit and veg out. And my understanding, especially after you doing this extensive research and looking at all the papers worldwide, is that actually fruit and vegetables contain significantly lower levels of histamine. Yes, some of them contain histamine, but it's significantly lower than the foods we've just gone through. And they might not need to be excluded at all, let alone in the vast quantities that a lot of our patients exclude them in. So they tend to be lower risk. But these fruit and veg, am I correct in thinking these particular ones are the ones that we know can be high histamine? So if you're going to take out any fruit and veg, it would be these that might be a problem. Is that correct?
Yeah, those came out higher, but as you've said, even those figures are still often way lower than the cured meats and the aged cheeses and the fermented foods that you've just talked about. The figures are often given just to give you a sense of the units. They're milligram per kilogram. That's what most of the lists give you the data for. The aubergine there, that was just under 40 milligrams per kilogram in one paper. And again, the other thing we've got to bear in mind is that there's often only one paper that's measured a few samples. We're not basing it on a huge number of samples to get these figures, and the levels are going to vary. That's say 40, whereas the cheeses could be in the hundreds, or some of the fermented foods much higher levels. So
Am I right in thinking that something like cheddar could be over 2,000, whereas aubergine is, under 40? Is that
It
correct?
can do, yeah, but again, it depends which paper you look at. For cheddar, for example, in one paper was 25, just histamine, and didn't contain, I think there's a small amount of putrescine. And then in another paper, the range that was given was 0 to over, like you say, over 2,000. So you get a huge variation. And I think Roquefort, that was one that was much higher one, really high on the, like in the thousands for tyramine, and in the hundreds for all the others. Often they're, yeah, the fruits and vegetables, even the ones that are considered to be high, are still a lot lower than these other foods.
So proportionally, you're talking about the fruit and veg just being a much less significant contributor to your histamine levels.
Yeah,
So are we saying that, if you're going to do the low histamine diet, yes, perhaps these ones on this page now, because they tend to be the ones, if you're going to look at fruit and veg, that are the problem.
yeah.
But all the other fruit and veg basically include, but take out the things we just went through now, just, the aged
Mm,
meat, the
mm,
mature cheeses, etc. The tomatoes, I want to touch on the tomatoes. So tomatoes
mm,
is a confusing area. We're talking about here concentrated tomato. We're talking about tinned tomatoes, ketchup, tomato puree or paste. What
mm.
about fresh tomatoes?
Often people find that they're okay with a fresh tomato,
Hmm.
and it is just those concentrated sources. And again, you've got to think about how often and how much of these foods that you would eat. I mean, yes, like ketchup, we've got ketchup there. That is, a concentrated form of tomatoes, but you're not going to drink a whole load of it. A small
Yeah.
dollop of it with your food may well be fine, and you don't need to worry about it. I mean, the figures I've got for tomatoes vary quite a bit. Some of them are literally barely, not even over 1 milligram per kilogram.
We're
Yeah.
saying that, something like a fresh tomato is actually very low in histamine. Is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah.
Yes.
To summarize here, what we're saying is that fruit and veg, not on this page here, are pretty much safe to eat and are not going to be contributing to your histamine levels in any major way. And that even these ones on this page are going to be significantly lower, like an aubergine under 40, whereas a cheddar cheese or mature cheese or Roquefort could be in the thousands. So we're talking proportion. Even these ones here are going to be low, and therefore you may be able to include them, you may be able to tolerate them, but certainly all other fruit and veg should be included in your diet, which will help keep your gut health and your health generally, your nutritional status better. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's all about what you exclude and you include with this low histamine diet. And that's something we
Mhm.
see as dietitians all the time, is people over excluding. So basically we've gone through the list here. You exclude what we've talked about. Don't take everything else out, because that's really important. You had a varied diet. And at the end of the day, what you're looking at when you do this diet, I want to reiterate that this diet is for 2 to 4 weeks, not any longer than that. And you're looking to see, are your symptoms better, or are your symptoms the same or worse? If they're better, that may suggest the histamine diet's helped. If they're worse or no different, it shows the histamine diet hasn't worked. Would you agree with that, Leanne?
Yes, absolutely. There's no point in continuing to avoid the foods if your symptoms have not improved.
Yeah.
And
I,
we,
yeah.
unfortunately, we do find that, particularly if people haven't got any dietetic support and they're struggling to do this on their own, often end up taking, like you said, more and more foods out of their diet unnecessarily because they need to look at other
Mm.
reasons why they've got symptoms.
That's really important, that if a diet has not worked, then it means that those foods are not relevant and you should put them back in your diet. And I'm sure you see this as well with a lot of patients. Like, they're terrified of putting the food back in. At the end of the day, what you have to think of is the logic here. If you've not improved, then that food or group of foods that you've removed is not responsible for your symptoms, and you need to put them back in. Otherwise, you end up with more and more restricted diet as you add another diet elimination program on top of the low histamine diet in a desperate attempt to try and improve things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really, really can't stress enough that if you're not better, come off the histamine diet. After 2 to 4 weeks, if you've improved,
Mm.
you reintroduce to a level of tolerance so you can get a clear note of how much of each of these foods you've tolerated. And I think you've touched on this as well. It's important in the long term that even foods that do cause symptoms may not need to be avoided all the time. But one of the things I want you to take me through here, Leanne, which I think is really important, is um, how people push through when they're reintroducing. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, it's I appreciate it's not an easy thing to do. Like you said, that there's often a degree of anxiety, and you can't do this reintroduction process blinded, can you? If you could do it without knowing what it is you're trying, then that might take away some of the worry. So what you're aiming to do is try one food at a time. Usually what I suggest is start with half a portion the first time, and then a day or two later try the full. If it's been okay, then try the full portion. Occasionally, some people who either very anxious or whose symptoms are really still struggling, what I've sometimes suggest is that they cook a portion of whatever it is they're testing and then freeze it in ice cube trays, so that you can test a teeny tiny amount at a time. And that sometimes can just help to build up your confidence, because you know you're only testing a small amount. And then if you're going to have symptoms, there's going to be milder symptoms.
What happens after that, Leanne?
Once you've identified which foods tolerated individually, you can start to combine foods at one meal or over one day. So it's important to bear in mind that small amounts of the higher foods may not actually need to be avoided completely, but you can be mindful of the overall amount that you've had over the day, so that you can spread out your intake of the higher foods rather than avoid them completely.
I think it's difficult for some patients because they will react even mildly to some foods. How should they approach this?
Got to decide, actually, are they significant enough symptoms to require me to continue avoiding those foods, or are they mild enough to say, okay, I can cope with that? And this is where we were talking earlier about the stress and the hypnotherapy and the breath work and all these other techniques, I think are really valuable at helping to calm your system so that you will be able to tolerate more. And you can, like you said, you can always, if you suspect something has caused symptoms, you can say, okay, right, I'll park that for a minute. I
Mm.
just say you sort of put it aside. Once your symptoms have settled down, you go on and test the next food. And then at some point in the future, you can come back to those foods that you suspected originally. And a bit further down the line, you may well be fine with
Mm.
it.
Don't give up on them forever, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes. I think
Mm.
that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Which low histamine diet list should you use? Because as we've mentioned several times, there are loads of them.
Yes, there are. I just had a look for a few different sources of information just to compare them. And you can see there, if you look at avocado, we've got three that say it's high, one says that it's safe in moderation. The yeast, two say it's safe, two say it's high. The nuts vary according to the different types of nuts. This is the difficulty. Different people will have different levels of tolerance, right? So the same foods are not necessarily, or same amount of foods are not necessarily going to be a problem for everybody. So we need to bear that in mind. And for each person, their level of tolerance could be influenced by these other factors that we've talked about, like hormones and stress. And then the data for all of these foods can vary. Rather than a specific figure, we'll often be given ranges. Like the avocado, for example, I've made a note here. There's a range for 0.58 to 5.44. And that was just for the tyramine, not for histamine. So it doesn't contain histamine.
Basically, you're saying that avocado might be high in some lists, but actually it's high because they've listed it's high in tyramine, not in histamine. But you're left thinking, oh, I can't have avocado because it's high in histamine. And I know that we talk about the competition between the other amines and their use of diamine oxidase. But fundamentally, if you're looking for foods high in histamine, it might be in the high list purely because it's high in a different amine, not histamine. I think that can
Yeah,
cause
I
confusion,
think
and
that,
it's not made clear. It's not made clear
no, it isn't.
on the
No.
on the lists.
Yes. And so whatever list you're looking at on the
Mm,
internet,
mm,
you need to know where they've got that data from. You
mm.
know, what are they basing that information on? The list is only as good as the data they've used.
And I think one of the major sources of confusion also comes from the fact that histamine levels can vary within the same food. So, the water, salt, oxygen content of a food, the availability within the food for proteins, amino acids, fermentable carbohydrates, all of these things can affect the histamine levels. And then you've got the different types of bacterial strain that might be used in processing. So, the processing of yogurt and cheese by different manufacturers may use different bacterial strains, which may then have different effects on the histamine levels of those foods. And finally, you've got the bacterial contamination or the poor storage of those foods with temperature and pH. All of these factors can make it really confusing because there can be different levels of histamine in exactly the same food. And of course, as we've already said, it's not always about the food. Sometimes it's about the individual person and their stress levels and hormone levels.
Yeah, yeah. So there's just so many
Mm.
different factors that can affect your level of tolerance, essentially. You can't produce a absolutely accurate list with this. It's just not possible because there's too many variables.
I think one of the problems with the lists is that they often refer to histamine liberators. And I think this confuses the picture because people are trying to go on a low histamine diet and nobody's quite sure what a histamine liberator is. What's your understanding about this?
Well, we haven't been able to find any references that explain what a histamine liberator actually is, but a lot of the lists do describe some foods as being histamine liberators, and that's why they're then listed overall as being high. It may have come from the fact that the food contains other amines, which indirectly increase the histamine by blocking the diamine oxidase, but we've not actually been able to find any clear evidence for a histamine liberator as such.
Yeah, as a separate entity, histamine
Yeah.
liberators don't appear to exist. It's perhaps
Mm,
a misunderstanding
mm.
about the competition between the other amines using up the diamine oxidase so that histamine hasn't got enough diamine oxidase to be processed. However, despite all the confusion, nearly all the lists available do agree on certain foods. They agree that fermented vegetables, fermented soya products, alcohol, aged meat and cured meat, aged cheese and fermented dairy, oily fish and non fresh fish, concentrated tomatoes, spinach, and aubergines are all high in histamine. But most fruit and vegetables, particularly on your extensive look at all the research worldwide, most fruit and vegetables are actually low in histamine content, as we've talked about before, quite substantially lower than the other foods that are in agreement across the lists. And a lot of the lists are really, really over restrictive. And this could put you at risk of malnutrition. I think that's really important to
Mm,
remember that
mm,
often you're not well anyway, because that's why you're doing the diet in the first place. And the last thing you need to be is malnourished on top of that. So, we really need to make sure that you're not over restricting your diet. Okay, let's move away from food lists. And we've had questions from patients, particularly asking about supplements and whether we feel that supplements are necessary for people on the low histamine diet.
yeah, there are a few key ones that I always recommend people do take. Certainly, we check that their intake is sufficient. So vitamin D, that goes for all of us, particularly through the winter months. It's really important. It's for our immunity and lots of other reasons. So we need to make sure we're getting enough vitamin D.
So that's nothing
Um,
to do with histamine, is it? That's
Not
just general
specifically, no,
general
but it is a
population.
general,
Mm.
that's something that I talk about with everybody. But in terms of the low histamine diet, if you're restricting your dairy intake, fish and shellfish, but all of those are the key sources of iodine. And certainly with dairy, I mean, your intake may well go down because you're perhaps cutting out cheese and yogurt, but you can still have milk or lactose-free milk if you don't tolerate the lactose. So you can still get some from the dairy products, but intake's probably going to drop. So we need to think about iodine intake, usually from an A to Z, not as a separate supplement. I'd usually do that as part of a general A to Z.
A
A
multivitamin meal.
multivitamin, yeah, yeah. And then of course, because we're taking out oily fish, and we know that the oily fish are very good for us for lots of other reasons, and with the omega-3 fats being sort of anti-inflammatory and good for heart health, etc. So I do tend to suggest that people take a fish oil supplement, and there's no reason why they shouldn't take a fish oil supplement, even though they're avoiding the actual fish. They're avoiding the body of the fish. I've not had anybody have a problem with fish oil, but if they'd rather not take the fish oil, or they don't eat fish anyway, then I'd go for an algae supplement instead. Calcium, again, along the same lines with the iodine, if you're avoiding, reducing your intake of dairy products with not having the yogurt and the cheese, then we still need to make sure that the calcium's coming from somewhere. You can increase your milk in other ways, like if instead of a yogurt, you could make a chia seed pudding, for example, and that's another way of getting your dairy. You can use whatever milk you want to make that, and that's quite easy. And you've got the chia seeds, which are really nice for your gut, or make rice pudding, or, there are other ways you could get the milk in, make smoothies if you're having less of the other dairy otherwise. But we need to make sure that you're still meeting your calcium requirements. I mean, again, it depends how long you're doing this. You're having to avoid these foods for a few weeks. Probably isn't going to do any harm. We're saying 2 to 4 weeks should be enough to see whether the diet helps. But obviously, if you end up having to then restrict your intake of some of these foods, for longer, then it's important to replace the nutrients.
I really want to stress that the low histamine diet is not a dairy-free diet. So what dairy can you have that
Yeah,
isn't
well,
histamine?
milk. So normal milk is fine. If you were having normal milk before and don't have a problem with the lactose in the milk, then you can carry on having milk, and you can use that in lots of things and make a point of having a bit more of it. But if lactose is an issue, then lactose-free milk is absolutely fine as well. You're still going to get the nutrition. And if you don't get on with cow's milk at all, you could have calcium fortified plant milks instead, and just remember to shake the carton so that the nutrients are all mixed in and not left at the bottom of the carton. Some of the softer cheeses are lower in histamine. Mozzarella and ricotta, cottage cheese, for example, they're fresher cheeses that are lower because they're not aged, like the
Mm,
cheddar and the
mm,
Roquefort,
mm.
etc.
So Leanne, what about chocolate? Because a lot of people love their chocolate. Can they have it on the low histamine diet?
Chocolate actually isn't that high in histamine specifically, but it does contain some of the other amines like tyramine. So it's a little bit higher in tyramine, but it's not nearly as high, again, as some of the other foods we've been talking about, like cheese, for example. So some people will find they are quite sensitive to it, but others will manage to have small amounts without needing to avoid it completely.
Are eggs high in histamine?
There's no evidence that eggs are a problem at all.
And what about cofactors that we talked about earlier that make, the wheels of the train that make the train move out of the station? The vitamin C,
Mm.
the B6, the copper are needed to make that diamine oxidase work. What sort of food should you be looking at to make sure you've got the wheels of your train working?
Obviously, lots of fruit and vegetables will contain vitamin C. So B6 you can find in fortified breakfast cereals, potatoes, in meat. We don't want the aged meats, and we want as fresh as possible. Fresh meats like beef, chicken, turkey will contain B6. Buy it as freshly as possible. So if you buy it in the supermarket, get it with the longest date on. And if you're not going to use it that day, stick it in the freezer, because that will halt the production of histamine. We've not got increasing levels whilst it's being stored and waiting to be used.
And the fish as well, are we saying you carry on having your white fish as long as it's fresh?
Yes, yes. And of course, it depends how fresh you can get it. But for a lot of people, the closest they're going to be able to get is frozen white fish. So that's what I usually suggest, is buy it frozen, and then on the assumption that it's been frozen quickly after being caught.
What about copper? Where do we get
And
copper
yeah,
from?
and then the copper, again, some meats like beef and turkey, the potatoes, again, mushrooms, certain seeds, whole wheat, asparagus. It's not something that we normally need to take as a separate supplement, and because it's in quite a wide range of foods. So
Okay. I think this has been really useful actually because it's really highlighted again that, the low histamine diet isn't about eliminating everything, and that, meat and fish can still be in the diet. Vegetables, fruit can still be in the diet. So,
yeah.
yeah, I think it's been really useful going through this supplement page. A lot of patients ask about probiotics. What's your feeling about those with your patients?
If we're thinking that the gut microbiome isn't as well balanced as it could be, then in theory, adding in a probiotic could be helpful. But we know that some bacteria possess that ability to produce histamine because they've got the enzyme, that histidine decarboxylase. So they're converting histidine into histamine. So if we've agreed that they're going to try a probiotic, then I've tried to go for products that say they don't contain histamine producing strains. And some of the companies will tell you whether that's the case or not. What I always say to patients is that you need to decide, am I happy to spend the money on this product in advance of not knowing for sure that it is going to work? You've got to be prepared to and know that you can afford to do that and try it for a decent length of time. A few weeks won't be enough. I think you need to try them for a good couple of months, 2 or 3 months, before you can really make a decision, in my opinion. And actually, the other thing to bear in mind when you do try a probiotic, it's not unusual to have more symptoms when you first start taking it. So often people get put off taking them because they feel worse in the first week or two, and it's not unusual for that to happen. And then the symptoms settle down and then begin to improve. So you've got to give them. I think you've got to give them a bit of time.
There are hundreds of different bacteria, and that's why it's so difficult, again, to get really solid evidence for what probiotic each person should take because it's so
Yeah,
individual.
yeah. We don't know whether somebody's going to need, find benefit from taking these products forever and a day, and whether they need to carry on always taking them. Certainly from a histamine point of view, we still don't know enough to be able to say, right, this is going to sort you out, and
Mm,
and
mm.
then you'll be able to eat what you want, unfortunately.
Come towards the end now. I think we've covered so much and you've been amazing at giving so many tips to people, and I really hope it helps them. But some of the top tips are that we really want you to eat a wide range of fruit and vegetables, as most of them are not high in histamine. Always replace foods that you're avoiding with nutritionally similar ones. So use milk and fresh cheeses if you're taking other dairy out. If you're taking things like spinach out, because that's one of the veg that is a little bit higher, then replace it with other green leafy veg. Choose meats that are really fresh. And if you're not going to use them immediately, freeze them on the same day and then defrost them the day you want them. Buy freshly caught or freshly frozen fish so it hasn't had time to degrade. Freeze any leftovers. So I know, especially these days, food costs an increasing amount of
Mm,
money. You don't want to waste leftovers. You want to keep them and be able to use them again. So freeze the leftovers and get them out when you next need them, rather than keeping them in the fridge in a Tupperware for days where the histamine level is going to go up. And there's insufficient evidence at the moment to recommend a particular probiotic for an individual person. But from what you're saying, Leanne, for some people probiotics help and for some people they don't. Is that
yeah,
correct?
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to summarize, so histamine intolerance is caused by the impaired production or the impaired function of the enzyme diamine oxidase.
Mhm.
If you think you've got histamine intolerance, because the symptoms can be quite similar to allergy, it may be worth discussing getting IgE mediated allergy tests done if your case history suggests this. But this is again where going to see a dietitian is so important, because a specialist allergy dietitian is going to look at that and see whether actually allergy testing is relevant for you, because it's really, really difficult to get hold of. You can be waiting 18 months to go and see an NHS allergy consultant. So, you don't want to waste your time if you've gone to see the dietitian because actually, I don't think allergy is anything to do with this. Then you can park that and go, right, I'm not going to waste time looking down that route. Measuring your DAO levels, we talked about, blood tests for those, and that's not helpful. The evidence is increasingly showing that you get mixed results and that not helpful at the moment to get your blood levels done. But that the supplements, the DAO supplements, may for some people help, and possibly along with the use of antihistamines. Really, you want to talk to a pharmacist or a GP about whether you should be taking antihistamines in the first place. And sometimes you may find the DAO supplements are enhanced with antihistamine use. Is that correct, Leanne?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds.
Okay. So we're drawing to a close now, and that's been a lot of information that we've given you. I just want to say an enormous thank you to the specialist team, Leanne Reeves, Deborah Howland, and Ashlyn Phelan, who have spent months and months collecting and analysing all the latest research on the low histamine diet so that patients can access the most accurate and up-to-date lists of foods and really know which foods they should avoid and which foods are safe to eat. I really can't underline enough, please see a specialist dietitian for support with this diet, because it's so important you remain healthy while you're on the diet. And finally, Leanne, we can't thank you enough. You've given up so much of your time and given us so much information. So thank you everybody for listening, and we really hope that you found it useful. Goodbye.